Okay, there we go. So hello and welcome to today's SCOPE webinar titled Warming Drives Poleward Range Contractions of Beringian Endemic Plant Species. So with respect and gratitude, I would like to first acknowledge that we are hosting this talk on the traditional territories of the Kwanlundun First Nation and Tanquichan Council. My name is Monique Chatterton and I am the Science Policy Advisor working with the Office of the Science Advisor for the Yukon Government. The Science Advisor, Sabrina Kinsella, is also in attendance today. So I am very pleased to introduce our speaker for today. So Toby O'Kay is a global change researcher with expertise in ecological modeling, ecosystem, and biodiversity change. Toby obtained a PhD in integrative biology at the University of Guelph in 2018. He completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Texas at Austin Marine Science Institute in 2020. He is currently a postdoctoral fellow with the Wildlife Conservation Society, Canada, and the University of Saskatchewan. He leads several Wildlife Conservation Society Canada climate change adaptation projects for the Northern Boreal Mountain Program. So I will turn it over to Toby for their presentation.
All right, thank you, Monique. Just going to share my slide now. It's strange. I can't see the PowerPoint now. What's going on here? Okay, I'm finding trouble locating the PowerPoint now. Let me see. Okay. Anyway. The PowerPoint is now just not coming up on the screen, so just apologize for that. Just I don't know what's going on.
You could try emailing it to me if it's not sharing on your screen. Let me see if I've not made you a co-host. Let me make sure. We did try here. Let me just I can check on my end. Okay. Let's see, maybe that will make a difference. Try that.
Oh, it's here now. All right. Okay.
Okay, excellent. Sorry about that.
It's okay. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes. Yeah, we see it with but still not on the slide. There we go. Perfect.
All right. All right.
Yeah, that's great.
All right. Sorry about that. Thank you for coming, everyone. This talk is coming directly from the paper that we recently published in Diversity and Distributions a few weeks ago. I had the privilege of leading this project, but other people contributed to the success of the project. I'd like to first acknowledge these people, starting with Diana Strawberry with Canadian Forest Service, Don Reed with Wildlife Conservation Society Canada, Bruce Bennett with our Yukon Conservation Data Center, Sid Cannings with our Canadian Wildlife Service, Caitlin Wheeler with Yukon Environment, Justin Fulkerson with our Alaska Center for Conservation Science, Hilary Cook also with Wildlife Conservation Society Canada. And lastly, the brain behind everything, Christopher and Tanka Pringle. I'm really grateful for this wonderful team. Now, we use this study to evaluate response of endemic species to warming at high latitudes. If you are familiar with literature on spatial pattern of species response to climate change, you have read somewhere that those species are expected to be moving northwards, generally speaking. And when I started looking at this literature, I was somewhere in South Texas, was working at University of Texas Marine Science Institute. We were looking at the shift in fish diversity across the Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico estuaries. We had massive data set. The data set dates back to the 70s. And even then, we started seeing these species moving northwards. but when at that point, I wasn't particularly extremely bothered by by the pattern that I was seeing until we started talking about looking at spatial pattern of response of species to climate change in the Yukon. And because the literature, the general hypothesis that the species generally will be moving towards the north. And it occurred to me that, well, if every species will be moving towards the north, and the north is warming faster than the rest of the globe, well, where would the species that are already at the edge of the continent, where would they go? And that sort of become the framework by which we started looking at the spatial pattern of response of species to climate change in the Yukon. Are we likely to see nowhere to go situation for some of these species? And another way by which these species might respond to climate change is to move to higher elevation areas. That again, we find ourselves in the same situation as nowhere to go situation because of the monotonic decline in mountain surface area with elevation. There's just not enough room at mountain peaks to accommodate a lot of species. And it's even more complicated for species that are endemic to these physiographically complex regions, because endemism, could have been caused by a combination of climate, topography, geological history, so especially soil. And this then means that for species to effectively respond to climate change, they will have to match two or more environmental factors within a limited dispersal space. So this is a tough situation for a lot of these endemic species. The question that we asked quite simply were, well, what are the key drivers of endemic species distribution in Northwest North America? What are the expected spatial pattern of response to projected changes in climate? And lastly, are there areas of stable distribution, that is potential in situ refugia from climate change, that is area in the current distribution that wouldn't change in the future? Now, we focus on Beringian and Amphi-Beringian endemics. Just to quickly orientate people, we're talking about areas that were unglaciated during the last glacier maximum, with mostly most of Northwest North America, Alaska, and the Yukon, and northern Eurasia. Now, if a species, for the purpose of this study, if a species is found on either side of Beringia, we simply refer to them as Beringian species. But species that are found on both sides of Beringia, we simply refer to them as Amphi-Beringian. So this is our study area per se. The white background, that's the extent of the glacier limits during the last glacier maximum. The shaded part, that's the unglaciated landscape. Now, if you are familiar with the history of Beringia, you might expect that the glacier extent to be wider than that. Remember, we are talking about last glacier maximum here. That's Lake Wisconsin glacier limits, not the maximum glacier. Of course, this is a modeling approach, modeling project. Initially, we identified 69 Beringian and Amphi-Beringian species, but we only had data for 66. So we cover virtually most of the species. We generate current and future model. For the current models, we use 1970 to 2000 climatology baseline. And for the future model, we use 2021 to 2040 climate data. You will notice that this is a relatively short window. And we did it on purpose because this particular study was directed towards conservation efforts in the Yukon. And in the Yukon, we really don't have the capacity to plan beyond 20 years into the future. And also, as we move into the future, beyond middle of the century, the climate data becomes, uncertainty in climate data becomes greater. So we thought we create something conservative, manageable within the scope of this time. We use intermediate socioeconomic pathway SSP 245. What that means is that the greenhouse gas emission will stay the same at the current rate, but it will drop off by the middle of the century. It's not going to get to zero, but it's going to just level off. We use two general circulation models, the CNMR model ESM2 and the UK ESM 10LL. The CNMR model is relatively moderate, but the UKS is more extreme. Overall, we use 4 climate, 4 topographic, and 2 soil variables. We use a simple modeling approach for this because if you have a lot of data, your choice of model is going to be a trivial exercise. But for us, with a lot of endemic species and species at risk, you typically don't have a lot of data for some of these species. So what we did was we use 4 different modeling algorithms: random forest, the 2 linear models, 2 machine learning, random forest, generalized boosted model, generalized linear model, generalized additive model. If people want to talk about this kind of modeling, we can talk about that. So each method will generate X number of models, but the model has to pass this threshold of true skill statistic of greater than or equal to 0.5, or AUC greater than or equal to 0.7. Then the model then had that model that passed the threshold, they then added to the ensemble model. Then we use that to build one robust model. Now, the advantage of doing this is that it removes a lot of uncertainties in the model, and also prevent model failure, because some models will work for certain species and may not work for the other. For instance, if random forest wouldn't work for a species, for a particular species, we still have 3 models that can capture that. Now, we have some measure of change. We look at change in latitudinal centroid, that is the mean latitude in the current, between the current and the future model. And we did the same thing for elevation centroids. We look at richness patterns, range losses. We also look at climate change exposure. What we mean by this is that some species in some areas, they'll be gaining habitat, in some areas they'll be losing. If a species is losing more habitat than it's gaining, that means the species will have negative exposure. And the species that's mostly gaining habitats will have positive exposure. And lastly, we look at area of stable distribution, that is in situ climate change refugia. That's area in the current distribution that wouldn't change in the future. So here are some of the data, some of the results, the model drivers. Overall, climate is the primary driver of these models. Of course, some of the models were driven by a combination of topography and soil, but climate stood out most among the variables. There was a particular variable that actually stood out, and that's the growing season temperature, and I'm going to talk about that shortly. And also the PDQ, that's precipitation of driest quarter. Driest quarter in the Yukon, that's is in the winter months, because average precipitation of driest quarter is around -14. So that's the winter in the Yukon. So here's what the shift in growing season temperatures look like. By growing season temperature, I mean mean of May to August temperature. So this is the baseline that we call the current, and these are the 2 general future models, future growing season temperatures. This is the upper image, that's the more moderate one. The below one, that's the more extreme UKESM one. As you can see, as we go from the baseline into the future model, you can see that warming is more prevalent across the Yukon and Alaska. And we're first shifting GST, growing season temperature, by 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. And especially in the interior of Alaska, that is characterized by dry subarctic and Arctic climate, because of the mountain barrier that prevents moisture movement to the interior region. So if this place if we are seeing increase in temperature in this place, and coupled with high winds that's prevalent in this area, a lot of these species are going to be in trouble, because then we are going to be seeing higher than normal evapotranspiration in this area. Yeah, as I said, another variable that stood out in the model was the winter precipitation. Again, this is the baseline, the current, these 2 are the future models, the future winter precipitation. We expect more than 70% increase in precipitation across North America. The precipitation as a mechanistic, it has a different mechanistic effect compared to growing season temperature, in the sense that a lot of these species that we model, they are perennial species, so they go to dormancy during the winter months. Increase in precipitation means that we are going to be seeing increase in snowfall, because below certain temperature, we are not going to see liquid precipitation. Then with increase in snowfall, we are going to see ground insolation, and this is going to prevent a lot of these species from going into dormancy. If they can't go into dormancy, that means they continue to expend carbon throughout the winter months. And when the spring comes around, they don't have enough carbon stored to perform basic reproductive and physiological functioning. So if they can't replace themselves, and they are not fit enough to withstand competition in their environment, they're likely not going to be around for a very long time. So here's directional pattern of range shift that we saw. basically, most of the species were expected will be shifting north. About 80% of our species should northward shift. So this is the pattern of latitudinal centroid. The volume plot here, the first one here, this is the current model. The next two, those are for the future model. As you can see from the box plot that's inside the volume plot here, the mean latitudinal centroid shifted as we go from the current to the future model. And you can also see that in the peak of the distribution of the volume plots move from the current to the future. And this is even more conspicuous as we look at the richness pattern between the current and the future models. This is the current models here, the pattern of richness, and this is the futures. You can see that's quite obvious here. When we look at the upslope disperser, that is elevational centroid, we didn't see the pattern of movement is not as conspicuous as we saw for the elevational for latitudinal centroid. As you can see, that the median elevation centroid is kind of flat between the current and the future models. But some of the species actually showed movement to higher elevation area. But you can see from the peak of the volume plot here that this place is the peak is now relatively flat. In fact, about 20 of the 36 species, tundra species that we model actually show significant movement to high elevation areas. But the pattern that I show you, they did not tell the whole story. We saw a drastic poleward range contraction and some expansion. Take a species like Artemisia glomerata, for instance. This is the current distribution of the species. This is the future distribution of projected distribution of the species. As you can see here, it seems to be losing the air, it's losing habitat, it's trailing edges, but seems to have nowhere to go at this point. Same thing with Dreba murray, but it's not quite this Dreba murray. It's not quite at the edge of the continent. But it still doesn't have anywhere to go. It doesn't, because, and I suspect that species like this, they're habitat specialists that are constrained by a lack of limited dispersal space as we go up north. Then there's species like Butricum alaskans that it seems not affected by climate change. It seems to be responding positively to climate change, and this also has its own implication because species like these, they have the tendency to create competition for species, for other species as the climate the environment becomes warmer. Now, generally, up to 70% of the species that we examine are expected to experience range contraction by the middle of the century. So one of the things that that our data set allow us to do is to sort of divide our models into habitat affiliation for some of these species. And within our data set, grassland and tundra species, they represent more than 80% of the species that we looked at. Tundra species, there are 36 of them. Grassland species, there are 19 of them. This is a pattern of range losses between the grassland and the tundra species. As you can see, although we have high number of species among tundra species, but proportionally, you can see that tundra species, they appear to be losing more habitat compared to the grassland species. And here's the general pattern of range losses and in situ refugia. That is all the species, all the 66 endemic species that we looked at. As you can see here, the pattern of range loss is all across Yukon and Alaska. It's not it's not localized in any sense. So here's a pattern of spatial in situ refugia. So it looks like a flip side of range losses. A lot of places that we have range losses, we are seeing, that we have low range losses, we are seeing that's where the climate change refugia are concentrated, especially in the interior, Alaska and the Yukon. Now, what is the conservation implication of this? One of the things that we did as part of this study was to look at how climate has changed, historically in the Yukon, and we found that winter precipitation has increased by 2 degrees in the last 2 decades compared with the two preceding decades since the 1980s, and winter precipitation by 30% as well. Now, what this means is that a lot of these species are currently occupying suboptimal climate. So how do we help them? One way by which we could help them is through translocation. And this can be beneficial in two ways. It can help bring these species closer to optimal environment without risking maladaptation. The idea here is to transfer the species to an environment that are 1 or 2 degrees cooler than where they are currently are. Because we transfer them to the whole extent of where the species we thought they might be, they might not adapt properly to that area. Another way by which we could help these species, that translocation might help these species to it can help them overcome barrier to dispersal, because a lot of these species, they are not able to disperse further than where they are because of barrier to dispersal, like mountains, river bodies, and so on. So if it can help them overcome those barriers, they might be able to continue on their own. But overall, the success of translocation will depend on understanding the life history strategies of these species, because there's an indication that some of these species are poor dispersers. And we have to know something about their competitive strategies, their reproductive strategies, their dispersal pathway for this to be successful. One of the interesting things about in situ refugia that we have identified this way is that the distribution model is going to identify areas that are in the area that are both occupied and unoccupied areas, because species do not always occupy all the suitable environments. So we can evaluate all these on unoccupied in situ refugia, and we can dedicate those to for translocation purposes. So another things that we can do with another way that we can deploy this concept of climate change refugia is an area of conservation land use planning priorities. My co-author, Diana Strawberg, she's done a great job along this line, where she used 3 types of micro refugia and combined this with different landscape metrics like topographic diversity, climate corridors, and human development index, and use the conservation software to kind of run these metrics to come up with area of conservation priorities. But we also both agree that, well, this is our course that we can use the species-specific in situ refugia that we just developed to kind of improve this concept, and that can be useful in terms of conservation land use planning purposes in the Yukon. Now, before I stop talking, I'm just going to quickly introduce the Yukon's Climate Change Adaptation Planning Atlas. This talk is part of the several climate change adaptation project that was initiated by WS Canada. And the idea here is that, the data that are coming from these studies, they can be used, by land use planners, different communities to sort of address change in their environment. So several, like over almost 200 species models that we generate as part of this has been uploaded to this data portal that we just launched. And if you go to species, for instance, and click on it, you're going to see the data there, and you can explore the data. If you're looking for data on climate change refugia, you can go to climate adaptation, and you can see pattern of richness, in situ climate change refugia, and habitat loss, and you can see all those ones are there. This here is the link to the portal. Now, this is the first phase of this web tool that we're developing. The second phase is going to come in the form of data visualization. This is going to allow interactive data visualization. The tools will also have allow overlay and extraction of data based on user-defined extent. You can also do map customization. As an example, this is the image to my left here. This is the breeding bird habitat suitability in southern lakes. To my right here, this is the agricultural suitability areas. If we are interested in doing anything, deploying area as agricultural activities, we might be interested in what we are compromising. So we can overlay this particular agricultural suitability on this. And if we do that, it's going to come clear to us that there's an area of conflict here, because area of suitable agricultural suitabilities kind of coincides with area of breeding birds suitability. So these two will allow us to make this kind of decision without knowing anything about programming or any other technical details of doing this. Now, as I said, this talk is WCS Canada. We have come up with a suite of climate change adaptation project, and we have a dedicated website for some of this project. You can go on this website. It's at yukonclimatechange.ca, and look at several of these projects that we have initiated and the stages that these projects are in, and we would like to have your comment on those things. We received a lot of funding for this project. Our primary funder was Environmental and Climate Change Canada, and we received additional funding from Wilberforce Foundation, and of course from Yukon South Beringian Privacy Place Initiative, WCS and WS Canada. There are individuals that are very helpful in terms of getting this project off the ground. People like Randy Moda, Greg Brunner, Mario Link. I'm really grateful to these people, because without them, we would have struggled a little bit to get this project going. Well, that's it from me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Toby, for that great presentation. So now I can open the floor for questions for discussion. Right, just a reminder, so you can indicate you have a question if your video is on by raising your hand, or you can use the reaction button in Zoom to let me know, and then I can call on folks as they indicate they have a question, or if you prefer, you can enter your question into the chat. Okay. Just make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay, I have a question. Okay. You talked about the translocation,
right,
of plants as a possible strategy. Are there risks? Are there any risks to translocation?
Well, there's no risk, because one of the things that comes with the approach that we use that we determine where a species should be translocated is that we use the area that the model has identified as suitable for the species, but they are not currently there, right? So we can move them, because species do not always occupy all the environment that is suitable for them, because it takes time for them to get there. So we just help them to get to those suitable habitat that they cannot get to by themselves. And one way that we can do this conservatively is, instead of, if we say they are going to go to, to say latitude 65 degrees, we can pull them, to a lower latitude, or where that temperature is relatively, it's not that, it's not that different, from where they currently are. Even if the model says they can be further than that. It's just a conservative way of testing that, well, they are going to survive around here.
In terms of model accuracy, is there sort of a range of accuracy?
Yes, so we were able to determine the uncertainties in the model. It's not, I just don't want to throw out the value here, because it wouldn't mean anything to people. So one of the things we're able to identify the accuracy of the model. The error in the model is very low. That's why we use multiple modeling algorithms. We didn't use one, we used 4 of them, and they all have different method of generating this model. So that was how we were able to generate a robust model. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, so I see we've had some questions come in. So we had a question, if you could please post the links to the website. So I think someone did that. Crystal did that, I think, in response. That's great. Right. And I can also, Toby, if you like, I can post the links in the scope newsletter too, so people can access those after. And I see there is a question here from, I think it's from Richard, so I can go ahead and read that out. Okay. So while temperatures and species survival are linked, what other things affect future species success? How plastic are the plants in terms of adapting to new temperatures? Will wildfires wipe the species slate clean? Will southern species move north? And are they more aggressive at surviving compared to local species? A few questions in there.
Yeah, so there's quite a few questions in there. A lot of these species that we're looking at, there's indication that they're not plastic. That's why they're in trouble. But some of them are the ones that are benefiting from climate change, the one that I showed you. I can't remember its name now. That they will do fine on their own. But a lot of these species that have narrow distribution, that have that specialist, they cannot do it on their own. So we have to find a way to help those. But in terms of how fire might influence future distribution of these species, it's one of the things that we will try to look at initially. YG, which we partner with some people from YG, the environment, they've generated a fire probability maps that we thought we could incorporate into this model, but it wasn't great enough that we couldn't do that. So we are coming up with fire probability models. Hopefully we'll be able to use that into some capacity to look at the effect of fire on these species distributions. But currently we don't have a sense of how fire might influence them, because it's not something that we're able to do in the first pass when we did this modeling. And as to the question whether the southern species will move north, that's what's happening here. A lot of southern species that are going to move north, because it's not that the species in the north are looking for a way to move further into the north, but as the north is becoming warmer, the warm environment is becoming suitable to other southern species. So as the species that are adaptable, they are adapted to cold climate, as they are trying to find cooler climate, the ones that are adapted to warm environment, they are moving up. So we are going to see a lot of competition, and I think that this has been realized in some places.
Thank you. Thanks for those questions and for those answers. There was one follow-up question here about specifically your precipitation figures, and asking if they were in millimeters.
Yes, they are millimeters. Yes.
Okay, great. And then there's another question here in the chat from, I think, from Crystal. So, and the question is, if you could translocate just one species from your study to see how it disperses into new refugia areas, which species would you choose and why?
Oh, that's a tough one. I haven't really thought about that, because there are 66 of them, and I'm looking at them. It's like a mosaic. Right? There's a Artemisia. There's a particular species that Draper Murray. That would be one of those species, because it seems like a habitat specialist. So I'm kind of curious as to, how much of in situ refugia we have for this species, and if we do transfer it to these areas, would it survive? Because it doesn't seem to be doing well in terms of when we look at the pattern of distribution into the future.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? I may have, if you had your hand up, your reaction button might only last for a while. So if I missed you, please put your reaction button up again. Just scrolling through different folks to see if I missed anyone. Okay, I do have another question, again, about translocation. Is this a strategy that has been used before in the Yukon, or in it? And I guess another question is, are we seeing this being used in other places?
Well, this has been used for a lot of wild animals, fox, wolves. They've been using it all across the world. But the thing is, they first have to assess the species themselves and their natural habitat. Then you can see whether how close that matches the new environment that you want to translocate them to. It's a known concept, but it's just difficult to identify. That's the problem in a lot of cases, whether the species are going to adapt to that environment really quickly, or do they have what they need? That's what we have to consider before moving them there.
Okay, thank you. I see there is a question from Bob. Bob, would you like to ask a question?
Yes. I'm thinking about things like habitat protection areas identified in the land claims final agreements, or identified by various organizations and put in place. They are put in place in specific geographic areas that we define based on current conditions. If we start translocating species, do we also start having to look at translocating habitat protection areas and that, those kind of tools?
Yes, that's precisely the idea for this, because a lot of these places that we're trying to protect right now, they are not necessarily the area that we should be protecting because things are shifting. So we are still planning for the climates of yesterday, and things will shift in the future. So we have to use these new tools to match our conservation priorities. So it's not. Yeah, so like you said, we need to start looking to redefine our understanding of areas that we need to protect.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
I think there's one more.
That might be Bob. I think that was Bob's question, or maybe I missed one. Let me check the chat too. Oh, yeah, I see there's another one here. And it's a question in the chat that I'll read out. And that is, oh, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. That is, how could you test the coastal areas for sensitivity to precipitation changes for the various models? Doubling precipitation is a huge thing to consider.
Yeah, so we consider precipitation as part of this modeling. So one of the things that the model will identify is species that are driven primarily by precipitation, and those that are driven by, say, temperature, like growing season temperature and so on. So we do know, species that are responding negatively to increase in precipitation versus those that are responding to warming per se. So they will be affected differently. And some, they are getting it from both ends. They get in trouble during the summer periods, and in the winter, they get it as well. So those as well, we'll have to find a way to address those.
Thanks for that. Okay, anyone else? Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands or anything unless I'm missing something here. Take one more look. Okay, I don't see any more questions, but thank you very much, Toby, for that presentation and discussion. So what we'll do is make this recording available through the Scope newsletter, post it on our Facebook page, and make some of the links that were shared available too. So folks can access those resources that Toby talked about today. So if that's all, and no further questions from anyone, I will close this webinar today. And once again, thank you so much, Toby, for that great information. Yeah, I look forward to seeing you all in the next Scope Talk.
All right, thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, bye.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.